The townsfolk of Red Pine thought they were so clever when they sent a heavy, unwanted baker up the mountain to marry a rugged hermit. It was supposed to be a cruel joke to drive him away, but by the first thaw, that mountain man would have burned the town to ashes before letting anyone take her from him. Constance Bradley was a woman the mining town of Red Pine, Montana, preferred to smell rather than see. As the sole proprietor of the town's only bakery, her days began long before the sun dared to breach the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. By dawn, the frosty air of Main Street was always thick with the scent of her cinnamon rolls, sourdough loaves, and bubbling berry pies. The locals gladly took her food, handing over their copper coins with eager hands, but their eyes rarely met hers. Constance was, by the harsh and unforgiving standards of 1,878, a very large woman. She carried significant weight, her frame broad and soft, her arms thick from years of kneading heavy dough. Where the other women of Red Pine boasted corseted, willow-thin waists, Constance wore loose, heavy wool dresses that draped over her abundant curves. She was 28 years old, carrying the heavy burden of being the town's invisible spinster. The townsfolk were entirely comfortable taking her hard work, but behind her back, the whispers were relentless. The cruelest among them was Mrs. Abigail Carmichael, the wife of the local bank manager, who often loudly remarked that Constance would need a team of draft horses to drag a man to the altar. Constance heard it all. She swallowed the humiliation, buried her tears beneath a stoic, round face, and poured her aching loneliness into her baking. High above Red Pine, living on the treacherous slopes of Whispering Ridge, was a man who cared nothing for the town or its people. Elias Boone was a mountain man in every sense of the word. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders like granite boulders and a thick, untamed beard, Elias was a solitary hunter and trapper. He owned 600 acres of prime old-growth timberland that Mayor Horace Pendleton desperately wanted to buy and sell to the railroad. But Elias refused to sell. He came down from the mountain only twice a year to trade furs for coffee, salt, and ammunition, glaring at anyone who dared step too close. He was considered a brute, a savage hermit, who spoke in grunts and held no civilized manners. But Elias had grown tired of the profound, deafening silence of his cabin. Approaching 40, the brutal winters were beginning to weigh on his soul. In late October, during his autumn supply run, Elias slapped a heavy leather pouch of gold dust onto the counter of the town's post office, which was managed by Mayor Horace Pendleton himself. Elias demanded the mayor place a classified advertisement in a Boston newspaper for a mail-order bride. He asked for a sturdy, honest woman willing to brave the harsh frontier in exchange for a loyal husband and a secure home. Horace Pendleton took the gold with a greedy, obsequious smile. But the moment Elias rode back up the mountain, the mayor burst into malicious laughter. Horace never sent the advertisement. Instead, he took the gold straight to Abigail Carmichael's parlor. Together, the two of them hatched a scheme that they believed was a stroke of absolute vindictive genius. They wanted Elias off that mountain, and they wanted a good laugh to break up the monotony of the impending winter. The next morning, Horace knocked on the door of the bakery. He found Constance covered in flour, her apron tied tightly around her wide waist. Removing his hat in a rare display of mock respect, Horace delivered a master class in deception. He told Constance that Elias Boone had seen her during his trips to town. He spun a fantastical lie, claiming that the mountain man had been deeply struck by her capable nature and her kind face. Horace presented Constance with a forged letter, allegedly dictated by Elias, asking for her hand in marriage. "He specifically asked for you, Constance," Horace lied, his eyes gleaming with hidden malice. "He said he needs a woman of substance, a woman who can weather the mountain, not one of these fragile society girls. He's paid the dowry, and he's waiting for you at the cabin." Constance felt her heart hammer painfully against her ribs. No man had ever looked at her with anything resembling desire, let alone requested her hand in marriage. A part of her, the rational, bruised part, whispered that it was too good to be true. But the desperate, suffocating loneliness that choked her every night overrode her caution. She wanted a home. She wanted a husband. She wanted a life outside the sweltering, solitary walls of the bakery. Against her better judgment, she agreed. The departure was staged as a twisted town spectacle. On a freezing November morning, Constance stood by a hired buckboard wagon, wearing her best wool dress, a dark navy garment that strained against her broad shoulders and heavy hips. The entire town seemed to have gathered. They cheered and waved, but Constance could see the smirks hidden behind gloved hands. She could hear the stifled giggles of the Carmichael daughters. She tried to ignore them, lifting her chin with whatever pride she could muster as the driver, an old drunk named Pete, snapped the reins. The journey up Whispering Ridge was brutal. The wagon bounced and violently jolted over rocks and icy ruts, the biting wind slicing through Constance's thick wool coat. By the time they reached the clearing where Elias's massive log cabin sat, the sky was bruised with the dark purple of an impending storm. Pete, eager to be rid of his passenger and return to the saloon, hastily dumped Constance's two modest trunks into the dirt. "Good luck to you, Miss Constance," Pete snickered, climbing back onto the wagon. Before she could even process the surroundings, Pete whipped the horses and the wagon rattled away down the treacherous trail, leaving her entirely alone in the freezing mountain air. Constance stood trembling, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The cabin door creaked open. Elias Boone stepped out onto the porch, a heavy Winchester rifle resting casually in his massive hand. He froze, his pale blue eyes widening in absolute shock. He looked at the heavy, shivering woman standing in his yard, then looked down the empty trail. The cruel reality of the situation hung in the icy air between them, waiting to shatter both their worlds. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, his jaw tightening so hard that the muscles fluttered beneath his thick, dark beard. He didn't know Constance Bradley personally, but he knew who she was. Every man in Red Pine knew the heavy baker woman whom the town treated like a stray dog. As his sharp eyes took in her shivering, rounded form, her simple, worn luggage, and the desperate, hopeful look on her red, wind-chapped face, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind. Horace Pendleton hadn't sent his gold to Boston. Horace had sent Constance. It was a joke. A vile, sickening joke meant to humiliate her and enrage him. The town elite expected Elias to be disgusted, to throw her out into the freezing wilderness, breaking her spirit entirely. They expected him to march down the mountain in a violent rage, giving Mayor Pendleton the legal excuse he needed to have him arrested or hanged, thus forfeiting his land. "Mr. Boone?" Constance's voice trembled, barely louder than the whistling wind whipping through the pines. She gripped her hands together over her large stomach, trying to stop shaking. "The mayor, he said you sent for me. I brought my things." Elias stepped off the porch, his heavy boots crunching in the fresh frost. He stopped a few feet from her. The anger rolling off him was palpable, a dark, heavy energy that made Constance instinctively take a step back. "Horace sent you," Elias growled, his voice a deep, rough baritone that sounded like grinding stones. "Did he tell you I asked for you by name?" Constance swallowed hard, a terrible, sinking feeling opening up like a void in her chest. "Yes. He gave me a letter. He said you wanted a woman of substance." Elias closed his eyes for a brief second, cursing the mayor to the deepest pits of hell. When he opened them, he looked at Constance with a mixture of burning fury and heavy pity. "There was no letter, Miss Bradley. I gave Horace gold to send an advertisement back east. I never asked for you. Those bastards in town sent you up here to make a fool out of both of us." The words struck Constance with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. Her round cheeks, already flushed from the cold, turned a stark, sickly white. The memory of the town cheering her departure, the smirks, the stifled laughter, it all suddenly made a horrifying, agonizing sense. They hadn't been celebrating her wedding. They had been celebrating the grand finale of their cruelest joke. They had dressed her up like a prized pig and sent her to the slaughter, fully expecting the terrifying mountain man to discard her. Hot, stinging tears welled in Constance's eyes, but a sudden, fierce rush of pride kept them from falling. She had spent her entire life being the butt of Red Pine's jokes, but this was a cruelty she could not bear. "I see," Constance said, her voice cracking before she forcibly leveled it. She reached down and grabbed the leather handles of her trunks with her thick, capable hands. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Boone. I will walk back down the mountain." She turned, her heavy woolen skirts dragging in the frost, and took a step toward the trail. "Don't be a fool," Elias snapped, stepping forward and easily ripping the heavy trunks from her grasp. "Look at the sky." Constance looked up. The purple bruises in the clouds had darkened to a terrifying charcoal gray. The wind was picking up, howling through the jagged peaks, carrying the sharp, stinging bite of ice crystals. "That's a whiteout coming," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You wouldn't make it 2 miles before you froze to death, and I'm not spending my spring dragging your body out of a snowbank. Get inside." Humiliated, frozen, and entirely devoid of options, Constance walked up the wooden steps and entered the cabin. It was surprisingly large, built of massive, hand-hewn logs. It smelled of wood smoke, tanned leather, and pine needles. It was incredibly clean but barren, lacking a single touch of softness. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, roaring with a healthy fire. Elias followed her in, dropping her trunks in the corner with a heavy thud. He locked the heavy wooden door behind them just as the first massive gust of the blizzard slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the glass in the windows. "You can have the bed," Elias said gruffly, pointing to the large timber frame in the corner piled high with thick bear and wolf pelts. "I'll take the floor by the fire. You're staying until the pass clears. Could be a week, could be a month." Constance stood awkwardly in the center of the room, acutely aware of the space she took up. She felt grotesque, unwanted, a massive burden shoved upon a man who had asked for someone entirely different. "I don't want your bed, Mr. Boone," she said stiffly, untying her bonnet. "I won't impose on you any more than I already have. I'll sleep by the fire, and I will pull my weight. I am not a helpless woman." Elias narrowed his eyes, studying her. He saw the deep, bleeding wound the town had inflicted on her pride, but he also saw the steel forming over it. She wasn't dissolving into hysterics. She wasn't begging for his affection. She was guarding herself. "Suit yourself," Elias muttered, turning his back to her to hang up his rifle. "Pantry is in the back. There's fresh venison hanging in the cold box. If you're going to pull your weight, you can start with supper." It was not an order of dominance, but an offering of distraction, and Constance recognized it as such. She marched to the small, rustic kitchen area. She found the venison, potatoes, and winter roots. She found the cast-iron pots. Her movements, normally perceived by the town as lumbering and slow, were surprisingly graceful and efficient in front of a hearth. For 2 hours, the cabin was filled only with the howling of the blizzard outside and the rhythmic chopping, stirring, and sizzling from the kitchen. Elias sat by the fire, whittling a piece of pine, covertly watching her. He watched the way she moved, the strength in her thick arms as she effortlessly hoisted a heavy iron Dutch oven. By the time she set a steaming wooden bowl of thick, rich stew in front of him, the cabin smelled better than it had in a decade. Elias took a bite. It was incredible, perfectly seasoned, the meat tender, the broth thick. He looked up at Constance, who was sitting across the small wooden table, eating in silence, her eyes firmly fixed on her bowl. "The joke's on them," Elias said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. Constance paused, looking up cautiously. "Excuse me?" Elias took another massive bite of the stew, chewing slowly before fixing his intense, pale eyes on hers. "They thought they were sending me a useless burden. They didn't know they were sending me the best damn cook in the territory. Tomorrow you show me how you make bread." Constance stared at him, looking for the mockery, looking for the hidden cruelty. But Elias Boone's rugged face held nothing but honest appraisal. For the first time since she had arrived in Red Pine 8 years ago, Constance felt a tiny, dangerous spark of warmth ignite in her chest. The storm raged violently outside, piling snow against the doors, sealing them off from the cruel world below. But inside the cabin, the thick, heavy ice was just beginning to thaw. The blizzard howled against the heavy timber walls of the cabin for 18 unrelenting days. In Red Pine, such a storm would have meant frozen pipes, dwindling coal reserves, and a miserable, huddled existence. Up on Whispering Ridge, however, it became a strange, quiet sanctuary. Cut off from the cruelty of the townsfolk, Constance and Elias settled into a rhythm dictated not by society, but by survival and mutual necessity. Constance quickly proved that her value extended far beyond the cruel punchline Horace Pendleton had intended. On her second morning in the cabin, she unpacked a small, wax-sealed crock from her trunk. It contained her sourdough starter, the lifeblood of her old bakery, kept alive through the freezing wagon ride by the heat of her own body. When she fed it with Elias's flour and water, the cabin filled with the rich, yeasty scent of impending sustenance. Elias spent the days maintaining their perimeter, digging out the chimney, and chopping the massive cords of firewood he had staged on the covered porch. Every time he stepped back inside, his beard caked with ice and his lungs burning from the cold, he was met with a wall of warmth and the smell of roasting meat, bubbling stews, and fresh, crusty bread. Constance kept the hearth blazing, her thick, capable hands always busy mending his torn wool socks, cleaning the cast-iron pans, or kneading heavy mounds of dough. She had expected Elias to treat her as a servant, to ignore her the way the men in town did, or worse, to mock her size. Instead, he watched her. He sat in his heavy wooden rocking chair by the fire, whittling or oiling his rifle, his pale blue eyes tracking her movements. It made Constance nervous at first, her cheeks flushing as she tried to hide her broad hips beneath her apron. But there was no disgust in his gaze. There was only a quiet, intense study. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into the storm, the wind temporarily died down, leaving a heavy, profound silence over the mountain. Constance was aggressively kneading a large batch of dough on the small kitchen table. The table was built for a taller man, and the angle forced her to hunch her shoulders uncomfortably. Elias suddenly stood up, setting his whittling knife aside. He walked over to her, his massive frame dwarfing hers, a feat very few men could manage. "Stop," he rumbled, his voice low. Constance froze, her hands sinking into the sticky dough, her heart giving a nervous flutter. Is something wrong with the bread, Mr. Boone?" "You're hurting your back," Elias stated plainly. He reached down, his large, calloused hands gripping the edge of the heavy oak table. With a grunt of effort, he lifted the entire table, dough and all, and moved it aside. He then went to the corner of the room, picked up his heavy felling axe, and walked back to the table. With 4 precise, brutal swings, he chopped 2 inches off the bottom of each stout wooden leg. He set the table back in front of her. It was now perfectly aligned with her waist. "Try it now," he said. Constance placed her hands on the dough and pressed down. The leverage was perfect. The strain on her shoulders vanished instantly. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, a lump forming in her throat. No one had ever altered the world to fit her before. She had always been expected to shrink herself to fit the world. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. He didn't step away. He looked down at her face, smudged with white flour, her chest rising and falling heavily beneath her woolen dress. "You don't need to apologize for the space you take up in this cabin, Constance. You're the strongest woman I've ever met. And I ain't just talking about the heavy lifting." He reached out, his thick, rough fingers gently brushing the flour from her cheek. The contrast of his rough hand against her soft skin sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. The touch was completely devoid of the mockery she had braced herself for all her life. It was reverent. "The town treated you like a beast of burden," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I see a woman who can survive the mountain, a woman who brings warmth to a place that's been freezing for 10 years. Constance's defenses, built up over 28 years of insults and isolation, shattered completely. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the flour on her cheek. Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her against his broad chest. Constance buried her face in his flannel shirt, inhaling the scent of pine, wood smoke, and man. She wrapped her thick arms around his waist, holding on as if he were an anchor in a raging sea. That night, Constance did not sleep on the pallet by the fire. Elias guided her to the large timber bed piled high with pelts. In the heavy darkness of the cabin, amidst the howling winds of the high country, they found a fierce, undeniable comfort in one another. Elias didn't want a fragile, fainting society girl. He worshipped the soft, substantial curves of his heavy bride, finding absolute perfection in the very traits the town had ridiculed. And Constance, for the first time in her life, learned what it felt like to be entirely, desperately desired. By late April, the brutal grip of winter finally broke. The snowpack began to melt, sending roaring torrents of ice water down the jagged slopes of Whispering Ridge, giving way to the vibrant green of Mountain Spring. The bitterroot flowers bloomed in aggressive patches of pink and white, and the air smelled of damp earth and new life. Down in Red Pine, Mayor Horace Pendleton was pacing the hardwood floor of his office, chewing nervously on the end of an unlit cigar. He had fully expected to see Elias Boone stride into town by March, furious and demanding his gold back, allowing Horace to have him arrested for disturbing the peace. But there had been no sign of the mountain man, nor the heavy baker woman. He probably shot her and threw her to the wolves, Abigail Carmichael gossiped over tea at the bank. Or they both froze to death. Either way, Mayor, the land is sitting empty. The railroad representatives are arriving next month. Horace agreed. Armed with a forged deed of foreclosure, and backed by the town's corrupt lawman, Sheriff Clayton Briggs, Horace assembled a small posse to ride up the mountain. They took 3 deputies and a heavy wagon to retrieve whatever pelts and valuables the deceased Elias might have left behind. The ride up the muddy, rutted trail was arduous. The men joked crudely about the stench they expected to find, laughing about the fate of the town's least desirable woman. But as they crested the final ridge and Elias's clearing came into view, the laughter died in their throats. The cabin was not an abandoned tomb. It was thriving. A large, perfectly tilled garden patch had been carved into the thawing earth. Freshly washed laundry flapped briskly on a line strung between 2 massive pines. Sitting on the porch, vigorously churning a barrel of fresh butter, was Constance. She wore a beautiful deep green dress made from fine trade wool, a color that brought out a striking, healthy flush in her cheeks. Her hair, usually scraped back into a harsh bun, was braided softly and pinned with carved wooden combs. She had not lost an ounce of her formidable size, but she no longer slouched to hide it. She sat with her spine straight, radiating a powerful, serene confidence. Horace reined in his horse, his jaw dropping open. "Constance?" he sputtered. Constance stopped churning. She wiped her hands on a clean white apron and stood up, walking to the edge of the porch. She looked down at the men who had orchestrated the cruelest day of her life. She felt no fear. She only felt a profound, overwhelming pity for their smallness. "Good morning, Mayor," Constance said, her voice carrying easily over the mountain breeze. "Sheriff Briggs, you've come a long way for a social call. We assumed you were dead," Clayton Briggs blurted out, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of his revolver. "We came to reclaim the property," Horace stammered, holding up the forged document. "Since Elias clearly abandoned you, the township is repossessing the acreage for unpaid taxes." "I haven't abandoned a damn thing, Horace." The deep, terrifying voice echoed from the tree line. Elias emerged from the timber, a massive buck slung effortlessly over his broad shoulders, his Winchester rifle resting in his right hand. He walked into the clearing, his pale eyes burning with a lethal intensity. The deputies nervously shifted their horses backward. Elias dropped the buck onto the dirt and stepped up onto the porch, standing shoulder to shoulder with Constance. He wrapped a thick, protective arm around her wide waist, pulling her flush against his side. It was an unmistakable claim, a display of devotion that left Horace staring in absolute disbelief. "You sent my wife up here as a joke, Horace," Elias growled, cocking the hammer of the Winchester with a sharp, metallic clack that echoed like a thunderclap. "It was the only good thing you've ever done in your miserable life. Now, "You're trespassing on my land. She's not your wife legally," Horace spat, desperate to salvage his scheme. "You never signed a registry. I am the magistrate, and I say this union is invalid. The land is forfeit." Elias didn't raise his voice, but the deadly calm in his tone made the horses stamp nervously. "Clayton, you tell your mare to look at my left hand." Sheriff Briggs squinted. On Elias's thick ring finger was a band woven from heavy copper wire. Constance wore a matching one. "We took our vows before God Almighty in the middle of a blizzard," Elias said. "But since you're so concerned with paperwork, Mayor, you can do your job right now." Elias gestured with the barrel of the rifle toward the saddlebag on Horace's horse. "Get out your county ledger. Write it down. Elias Boone and Constance Boone, lawfully wedded, with full survivorship rights to this land. You write it, you stamp it, and you sign it, or God is my witness, you'll be walking back to Red Pine with a bullet in your knee." Horace looked at the sheriff for backup, but Clayton Briggs was staring at the ground, having no desire to draw against the best shot in the territory. Sweating profusely, Horace fumbled for his ledger and a fountain pen. He rested the book on his saddle horn and furiously scribbled the legal recognition of the marriage, his hands shaking violently. When he was done, Elias walked down, snatched the ledger, checked the signature, and tore the page out, folding it into his shirt pocket. "Now," Elias whispered, stepping so close to Horace that the horse whinnied in panic. "If I ever see you, your sheriff, or any man from that town on Whispering Ridge again, I won't give a warning. You tell Abigail Carmichael she was right. It did take a team of draft horses to get Constance up here, but it's going to take an army to take her away from me. Get off my mountain." Horace violently whipped his horse around, fleeing down the trail with the sheriff and deputies close behind, their grand scheme shattered into 1,000 pieces. Elias watched them until they disappeared into the pines. He then turned back to the porch. Constance was smiling, a genuine, radiant expression that made her face light up like the morning sun. Elias walked up the steps, set his rifle aside, and took her face in his large, rough hands, kissing her deeply as the mountain wind blew the scent of pine and fresh earth around them. The town of Red Pine had sent him a heavy bride to break him, but instead, they had given him the very anchor his soul needed to finally call the mountain a home. The summer of 1879 brought an unprecedented bounty to Whispering Ridge. The high mountain meadows burst with wildflowers, and Elias's traps yielded an exceptional harvest. But the peace they had forged was fragile. Horace Pendleton's desperation was growing like a malignant weed. The Northern Pacific Railway was expanding its steel arteries across the Montana Territory, and the chief engineer, W.K. Dye, Milnor Roberts, was scheduled to arrive in Red Pine by late July. The railway needed a gradual incline to lay tracks over the Bitterroot Pass, and Elias's acreage was the only viable route. Horace knew that if Elias sold the land directly to the railway, the mountain man would become a titan of wealth, while the town of Red Pine and the mayor's own empty pockets would see nothing. The mayor needed to force Elias out before W. Milnor Roberts arrived. However, Horace severely underestimated the intellect of the woman he had treated like a simpleton for 8 years. During her years sweating over the ovens at the town bakery, Constance had been entirely invisible. Men like Horace Pendleton and bank manager Calvin Carmichael had routinely used her bakery as a warm, private place to discuss their illicit affairs, assuming the heavy, flour-covered woman kneading dough in the corner was too slow-witted to comprehend their schemes. One evening, while Constance and Elias were snapping green beans on the porch, a realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. "Elias," Constance said, dropping a handful of beans into the wooden bowl, "Horace isn't trying to seize this land for the township. He's trying to steal it for himself." Elias stopped his whittling, his brow furrowing. He claimed it was for unpaid taxes. "He lied," Constance stated, her mind racing as pieces of overheard conversations from years past suddenly aligned. 3 years ago, I heard Calvin Carmichael tell the mayor that the town's emergency fund was entirely depleted. Horace had been siphoning the money into a private account in Helena. When they realized the Northern Pacific was coming, Horace panicked. He needs this land to sell to W. Milnor Roberts for a fortune, so he can replace the embezzled town funds before the federal marshals audit the county. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Elias's bearded face. He looked at his wife with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. "You know how to prove this?" "I know exactly which ledger Calvin keeps the fake accounts in," Constance said, her eyes flashing with a sharp, brilliant light. "It's the red leather-bound book locked in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. I saw him hide it twice when the bank examiners came through." The next morning, the Boones hitched a team of magnificent draft horses to a newly built wagon. Constance did not wear the drab, oversized rags of her past. She wore a tailored bodice of crimson silk and a heavy black riding skirt, her hair elegantly styled, a lavish silver fox fur draped over her broad shoulders. Elias sat beside her, clad in a crisp, dark suit he had traded a fortune in pelts to acquire, his trusty Winchester resting across his lap. When the wagon rolled onto the dusty main street of Red Pine, the town ground to an absolute halt. Abigail Carmichael dropped her parasol in the dirt. Sheriff Clayton Briggs stepped out of the jailhouse, his face draining of all color. The townsfolk stared in stunned silence. The woman they had sent up the mountain as a cruel joke had returned looking like a frontier queen, radiating power, wealth, and an untouchable dignity, flanked by a man who looked ready to level the entire town if anyone dared insult her. They pulled the wagon to a stop right in front of the Red Pine Hotel. Tied to the hitching post were several fine thoroughbreds bearing the brand of the Northern Pacific Railway. Elias helped Constance down, his large hand resting protectively on the small of her back. Together, they pushed through the swinging doors of the hotel saloon. Inside, Mayor Horace Pendleton was aggressively pouring whiskey for a distinguished older gentleman in a tailored gray suit, Chief Engineer W. Milnor Roberts. "I assure you, Mr. Roberts," Horace was sweating, his voice desperate, "the Boone property is tied up in a municipal tax dispute. I can sign the right-of-way over to the railway today for $10,000, and the town will handle the eviction of the squatter." "He isn't a squatter, Mayor." Constance's voice rang out, clear and commanding, instantly silencing the saloon. Horace spun around, the whiskey bottle slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floorboards. "Constance, what is the meaning of this? Sheriff, remove these people." Clayton Briggs took one step forward, but Elias simply shifted his weight, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. The sheriff froze, raising his hands and stepping back. W. Milnor Roberts stood up, assessing the imposing couple with keen interest. "And who might you be, madam?" "I am Constance Boone, the lawful owner of the Whispering Ridge acreage, alongside my husband Elias," she said, stepping forward. She did not shrink. She let her presence fill the room. "Mayor Pendleton does not own the land. Furthermore, he is attempting to defraud the Northern Pacific Railway to cover up his own embezzlement of Red Pine's municipal funds." Chaos erupted in the saloon. Calvin Carmichael tried to make a run for the back door, but Elias's massive hand shot out, grabbing the banker by the scruff of his neck and hurling him back into the center of the room. "You're lying!" Horace shrieked, his face turning a blotchy, furious purple. "She's a crazy baker woman, a fat, discarded joke." Before Elias could draw his weapon, Constance stepped up and delivered a resounding, vicious slap across Horace's face. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The mayor crumpled to his knees, clutching his bleeding lip. "The proof is in a red leather ledger in Mr. Carmichael's bottom desk drawer," Constance told Mr. Roberts calmly, adjusting her fur shawl. "It details every stolen cent. We will gladly allow your men to inspect it. As for the railway, my husband and I are willing to negotiate a right-of-way through our land, but we will not sell. We will lease it to the Northern Pacific for $2,000 a year, and the town of Red Pine gets nothing." W. Milnor Roberts looked at the cowering mayor, then at the brilliant, formidable woman standing before him. He chuckled, a deep, booming laugh of genuine respect. "Mrs. Boone, you drive a hard bargain. I accept your terms." By sunset, federal marshals were called to arrest Horace Pendleton and Calvin Carmichael. The cruelest gossips of Red Pine, including Abigail, were left destitute and disgraced. Constance and Elias walked out of the town with their heads held high, their pockets lined with railway money, and their vengeance absolute. They returned to the mountain, where the air was clean, and the love they had forged in the bitter cold burned brighter than the summer sun. The cruel joke of Red Pine ultimately became the greatest blessing of Constance and Elias's lives. They built a sprawling, prosperous cattle ranch on Whispering Ridge, their profound love outlasting the very town that had once tried to break them. If you were captivated by this tale of sweet vengeance, resilience, and frontier romance, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical dramas.
Hi, my name is Prairie Rose, the owner and manager of Obese Girl, Oregon. After watching the video, the town sent him a heavy bride as a cruel joke. By winter, he wouldn't let her go. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was the reminder that a person's worth can't be measured by appearance or someone else's cruel judgment. Sometimes respect grows when we truly take the time to know someone. Have you ever been surprised by someone you first misunderstood? I hope this story reminds us to judge a little less and listen a little more. If it meant something to you, share your thoughts below and feel free to like or subscribe.